Queen Victoria Eugenie of Spain lived a life filled with grandeur, love, heartbreak, and tragedy. Born a British princess and the granddaughter of Queen Victoria, she became Queen of Spain through a whirlwind romance with King Alfonso XIII. But what seemed like a fairy tale soon turned into a life of sorrow, betrayal, and political turmoil. From surviving an assassination attempt on her wedding day to facing personal and national tragedies, her story is one of resilience and duty. Today, we uncover the story of the difficult married life of Queen Victoria Eugenie of Spain, a tale of love, sacrifice, and a queen who never truly found happiness. Born on October 24, 1887, at Balmoral Castle in Scotland, Victoria Eugenie Julia Anna of Battenberg came into the world as a member of both the British and German royal families. Her parents, Princess Beatrice and Prince Henry of Battenberg, ensured that she had strong ties to European royalty. Her mother was the youngest daughter of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, making Victoria Eugenie the granddaughter of the British monarch who had shaped the 19th century. Meanwhile, her father, Prince Henry, was a member of the House of Battenberg, a morganatic branch of the ruling family of Hesse. Victoria Eugenie was named after two powerful women, her grandmother, Queen Victoria, and Empress Eugenie of France, the Spanish-born consort of Napoleon III. Yet, within her family, the young princess was affectionately known by a much simpler name, Anna. Her birth coincided with an important milestone, Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee, celebrating 50 years on the throne. This earned her the nickname Jubilee Baby, symbolizing both a new generation of royals and a continuation of the family's legacy. Despite her aristocratic birth, Anna's early years were deeply influenced by the complex dynamics within Queen Victoria's household. Her mother, Princess Beatrice, had been deeply affected by the loss of her father, Prince Albert, who died when she was only 4 years old. Overcome with grief, Queen Victoria withdrew from public life and clung tightly to Beatrice, treating her as a source of emotional support. Unlike her older sisters, Beatrice was expected to remain by her mother's side indefinitely, acting as her personal secretary and closest confidant. For years, Beatrice remained unmarried, as Queen Victoria refused to let her leave. The Queen's intense attachment to her youngest daughter made her highly reluctant to allow Beatrice to wed, fearing it would mean losing her last remaining companion. It wasn't until Beatrice met Prince Henry of Battenberg that the Queen was finally forced to reconsider. Even then, she only gave her approval under one strict condition: Beatrice and Henry had to live with her, and Beatrice had to continue serving as her secretary even after marriage. Because of this unusual arrangement, Anna's childhood was spent deep within the royal world of Queen Victoria. She grew up in the Queen's household, dividing her time between Windsor Castle, Balmoral Castle, and Osborne House on the Isle of Wight. Surrounded by wealth, tradition, and the strict moral expectations of the Victorian era, she lived in an environment of both luxury and formality. In 1901, the death of Queen Victoria marked the end of an era, not only for the British Empire but also for Victoria Eugenie's childhood. With her grandmother gone, the world she had known changed forever. Princess Beatrice, who had spent decades as the Queen's closest confidant, suddenly found herself with little influence at court. Her relationship with her brother, King Edward VII, was distant at best, and without her mother's protection, her status declined significantly. As a result, when Edward ascended the throne, Beatrice and her children had no choice but to move into Kensington Palace, leaving behind the privileged position they had once enjoyed in Queen Victoria's household. As the years passed, Victoria Eugenie began to attract attention for more than just her royal lineage. She grew into a striking young woman, tall, elegant, and well-proportioned, with a delicate oval-shaped face. Her golden blonde hair and graceful demeanor made her a standout at court. But beyond her beauty, she had also received a first-class royal education, preparing her for a future that would inevitably be intertwined with European aristocracy. With these qualities, it was no surprise that she had no shortage of admirers. In 1905, a young king arrived in Britain, unknowingly setting the stage for the next great chapter of Victoria Eugenie's life. King Alfonso XIII of Spain, just 19 years old, was embarking on a tour of Europe. Rumors quickly spread that he was in search of a wife, as he had yet to find a suitable queen. Born after his father's death, Alfonso had been raised with the weight of the Spanish crown on his shoulders. Now, as he traveled from one royal court to another, speculation grew over which European princess would win his favor. Many believed his heart was set on Princess Patricia of Connaught, another granddaughter of Queen Victoria. In fact, at formal events, Alfonso was deliberately seated next to Patricia, fueling gossip that a match was imminent. But the young king had other ideas. During one such gathering, Alfonso's attention was drawn elsewhere. His gaze locked onto a young woman with golden blonde hair, and he couldn't help but ask, "Who is that?" The answer surprised him. This wasn't the highly anticipated Princess Patricia, but rather her cousin, Princess Victoria Eugenie of Battenberg. The next evening, at a grand ball, Alfonso's fascination only deepened. He watched Victoria Eugenie closely, captivated by her presence. Eventually, unable to resist, he approached her and struck up a conversation. There was just one problem: Alfonso barely spoke English, and Victoria Eugenie didn't know Spanish. Instead, they stumbled through an awkward but charming conversation in French, the only language they had in common. It was an inauspicious start, but for Alfonso, it was enough. That night, his heart was set, not on the princess everyone expected, but on the unexpected blonde who had captured his attention. As the evening continued, Alfonso eagerly invited Victoria Eugenie to dance. While they moved across the ballroom, he leaned in and playfully asked, "How about I send you some postcards?" "Oh, please don't say no to me." At the time, it was fashionable for young noblewomen to collect postcards from different countries, making his offer both charming and thoughtful. Victoria Eugenie, flattered by the gesture, graciously accepted, and in that moment, something between them changed. Their connection quickly blossomed into something deeper. After Alfonso's visit to London, he followed through on his promise, sending her postcards from various places he traveled. What began as a simple exchange soon turned into something much more meaningful. The two started writing letters to one another, and as the months passed, their affection only grew stronger. They were no longer just two young royals exchanging pleasantries, they were falling in love. Realizing that their relationship had the potential to become something serious, Victoria Eugenie took the first step toward bridging the gap between their worlds. She began learning Spanish. Meanwhile, Alfonso, completely smitten, confided in his mother, Queen Maria Cristina of Austria, and declared his intention to marry Victoria Eugenie. But not everyone was thrilled about the match. Maria Cristina immediately saw two major obstacles that made Victoria Eugenie an unsuitable bride. The first was religion. Spain was a deeply Catholic country, while Victoria Eugenie was Protestant. A union between them would not only require her conversion, but it could also face resistance from the Spanish people and the powerful Catholic Church. However, it was the second issue that troubled Maria Cristina the most: hemophilia. The disease, which was known as the royal disease, due to its prevalence in Queen Victoria's descendants, had already claimed several lives in European monarchies. Victoria Eugenie's brother, Prince Leopold, suffered from the condition, meaning that she had a 50% chance of being a carrier. Though medical knowledge at the time was limited, Maria Cristina feared that if Alfonso married her, their future children could inherit the disease, putting Spain's royal bloodline at risk. For these reasons, Maria Cristina strongly opposed the match and urged her son to reconsider. But Alfonso, deeply in love, refused to listen. Nothing could shake his determination to marry Victoria Eugenie, not even his mother's objections. The following year, fate brought the couple together once again, this time in Biarritz, a picturesque seaside town in southwestern France. Away from the pressures of court, they were able to enjoy each other's company in a more relaxed setting. There, they made an unspoken promise to one another: their love was real, and they would find a way to be together. Though not yet officially engaged, their hearts were already set on a future together. On May 24, 1906, Victoria Eugenie set off on the journey that would change her life forever. Traveling aboard a British warship, she crossed the sea to France before continuing by special train to Spain. As she arrived at the Spanish border, she was met with great fanfare. The Prime Minister and the Minister of Foreign Affairs personally welcomed her, marking the beginning of her new role as Spain's future queen. Meanwhile, in Madrid, excitement filled the air. Crowds had gathered from all over the country, dressed in their finest clothes, carrying flowers and bottles of wine, eager to celebrate the royal union. Cheering voices echoed through the streets, with people calling out joyfully, "Long live the King! Long live the Queen!" The entire city was alive with anticipation. The festivities grew even grander as envoys from across Europe arrived in Madrid, bringing lavish gifts and warm congratulations. The Spanish capital became the center of an extraordinary celebration, with streets bustling with music, parades, and endless excitement. On the morning of the wedding, Victoria Eugenie made her grand appearance, wearing an exquisitely tailored gown, crafted by the most skilled dressmakers in Madrid. To complete her regal look, she wore a tiara shaped like irises, a wedding gift from Alfonso himself. At her side, King Alfonso XIII stood proudly in the uniform of a marshal of the Spanish army, his chest adorned with the prestigious Order of the Golden Fleece. The royal couple climbed into a magnificent carriage drawn by 8 white horses, setting off on their wedding procession through the streets of Madrid. On both sides of the road, thousands of onlookers lined up, their cheers creating a deafening roar. The entire city seemed to be swept up in the moment, celebrating the union of their king and his beautiful new queen. The ceremony took place at the royal monastery of San Geronimo, a breathtaking sight on such a historic day. As the couple exchanged vows before God and the Spanish court, the ambassador of the Roman Curia delivered his final blessings, sealing their marriage in the presence of royalty, dignitaries, and an adoring nation. After leaving the church, the newlyweds stepped into a magnificent royal carriage, drawn by 8 white horses and surrounded by royal guards. The streets of Madrid, lined with thousands of people, echoed with cheers, music, and celebrations. The air was filled with the scent of fresh flowers, which had been scattered along the parade route in honor of the new queen. Alfonso sat proudly beside his bride, smiling and waving to the adoring crowds, while Victoria Eugenie, though slightly overwhelmed by the grandeur of it all, soaked in the excitement of her new life. Just as the carriage made its way through the Calle Mayor, the heart of the city, something unexpected happened. A bouquet of flowers, thrown from a nearby balcony, sailed toward the royal couple. At first, no one thought anything of it. After all, the streets were filled with well-wishers throwing petals and gifts. But in an instant, the festive joy turned into horror. A deafening explosion ripped through the air, shattering windows and shaking the ground beneath them. The bomb, cleverly hidden within the bouquet, detonated just a few feet from the carriage. The force of the blast sent bystanders flying to the ground, while the horses reared up in terror. Screams of panic and agony filled the air as thick smoke clouded the once bright streets. Guards rushed to protect the king and queen, drawing their swords, their eyes scanning the crowd for an attacker. But the damage had already been done. The scene that followed was one of unimaginable chaos. People ran in every direction, desperately searching for loved ones amid the carnage. The streets that had moments ago been filled with cheers and music were now filled with the groans of the wounded and the cries of those who had lost their lives. The bombing left 23 people dead and more than 100 injured, turning what should have been the most joyous day of Victoria Eugenie's life into a nightmare. Miraculously, Alfonso and Victoria Eugenie emerged physically unharmed, but the attack left a lasting scar, not just on them, but on the Spanish people. Many saw the bombing as a terrible omen, a dark warning of troubles to come. Instead of a fairy tale beginning, Victoria Eugenie's first day as queen was marked by bloodshed and tragedy. In the aftermath of the attack, King Alfonso became consumed by the pursuit of those responsible. His focus turned away from his new bride as he threw himself into the investigation, determined to bring the culprits to justice. Meanwhile, Queen Mother Maria Christina's disapproval of Victoria Eugenie only deepened. She had never supported the marriage, and after such a horrific start to her son's union, she seemed even more convinced that Victoria Eugenie was not the right choice for Spain. Victoria Eugenie found herself isolated in her new home, trapped in a palace where she barely understood the language and had few allies. Her husband, preoccupied with his duties as king, had little time to support her, while her mother-in-law remained cold and distant, making her transition into Spanish court life all the more difficult. The fairy tale she had dreamed of was already crumbling. But in autumn of 1906, everything changed. Victoria Eugenie discovered she was pregnant. In any royal court, the birth of an heir was of utmost importance, and suddenly, she found herself at the center of attention once again. Spanish noblewomen who had once dismissed her now welcomed her with warm smiles, and the whispers of disapproval that had followed her since her arrival in Spain began to fade. When she finally gave birth, the excitement reached new heights. It was a son, a healthy baby boy named Alfonso, in honor of his father. With that, Victoria Eugenie had done what was expected of her. She had secured the future of the Spanish monarchy. Almost overnight, public sentiment toward her shifted, and those who had once doubted her began to embrace her as their queen. Even Maria Cristina, who had been her harshest critic, softened her stance, at least for a time. For the first time since arriving in Spain, Victoria Eugenie felt a sense of belonging. She had won over many of her skeptics, and for a moment, it seemed as though her place in the Spanish monarchy was secure. But her struggles were far from over. The challenges that lay ahead would test her strength, her marriage, and the very stability of the Spanish throne. Victoria Eugenie's newfound happiness was tragically short-lived. Just when it seemed like she had secured her place in the Spanish royal family, fate delivered a devastating blow. Shortly after the birth of her son, during what should have been a routine circumcision procedure, the doctors made a chilling discovery: the infant would not stop bleeding. It was a telltale sign of hemophilia, the very disease that Queen Maria Cristina had feared from the beginning. Victoria Eugenie was stunned and heartbroken. Though she had never shown symptoms herself, she now understood the truth: she was not a patient, but a carrier of the disease. And now, she had unknowingly passed it on to her firstborn son, the heir to the Spanish throne. When Alfonso learned the news, his grief quickly turned to fury. He lashed out at Victoria Eugenie, blaming her for bringing this curse into the Spanish royal bloodline. Despite the fact that his mother had warned him about the risks before the wedding, he refused to accept any responsibility. Instead, he directed all his anger toward his wife, as if she had knowingly doomed their son. But what could Victoria Eugenie do? There was no cure, no way to undo what had already been done. The only thing she could do was try to make it right in the only way she knew how, by giving birth to another child, hoping that this time, fate would be kinder. In 1908, she gave birth to a second son, Jamie, and to her relief, the doctors confirmed that he did not have hemophilia. For the first time in 2 years, Victoria Eugenie allowed herself to hope. She believed that perhaps this child would bring them back together, that Alfonso would finally set aside his resentment and return to the loving husband he had once been. But fate was not done testing her. Before Jamie even had a chance to grow up, he developed a severe ear infection. What should have been a minor childhood illness quickly turned into a catastrophe, leaving the young prince permanently deaf. This second misfortune only deepened Alfonso's resentment. He saw it as yet another disaster brought upon Spain by his wife, and instead of supporting her through the ordeal, he turned even colder. His words became crueler, his affection more distant. In his eyes, Victoria Eugenie had not only brought a blood disease into the family, but now she had also given him a disabled son. The king never forgave her. And as the years passed, their marriage, already strained, began to fall apart entirely. For Victoria Eugenie, the challenges kept piling up. She struggled with learning Spanish, and with little support from those around her, progress was painfully slow. Though she made every effort to adapt to Spanish customs and traditions, there were moments when her foreign upbringing became impossible to hide. One such moment occurred when she attended a bullfight, an event deeply cherished in Spanish culture. As the spectacle unfolded before her, her face betrayed her true feelings. The violence of the sport unsettled her, and despite her best efforts to remain composed, her discomfort was obvious to the crowd. In Spain, bullfighting wasn't just entertainment, it was a national passion, a symbol of identity and tradition. The Queen's visible unease sent the wrong message. People began to whisper that she was too British, too distant, and that deep down, she didn't truly see herself as Spanish. Her struggles at court had already strained her marriage, but with the outbreak of World War I, tensions in the royal family reached a breaking point. The war divided not just Europe, but also the Spanish court. Victoria Eugenie, as the granddaughter of Queen Victoria, was naturally sympathetic to Britain and its allies. Meanwhile, her mother-in-law, Maria Cristina, had been born an Austrian archduchess and harbored strong pro-German sentiments. And caught between them was King Alfonso XIII, who declared Spain neutral. Though Alfonso had publicly committed to neutrality, many suspected that the Queen might privately influence his decisions. With Maria Cristina's long-standing authority in Spain, political circles began whispering against Victoria Eugenie, convinced that she would use her British connections to push Spain toward the Allied cause. However, these fears were completely unfounded, because, in reality, Victoria Eugenie hardly saw her husband at all. By this time, Alfonso had openly taken multiple mistresses and was fathering illegitimate children without even attempting to hide it. The king's blatant affairs were an open secret, and no one in the palace, not even Victoria Eugenie, could do anything about it. He had already sired 4 or 5 children outside of his marriage, and his growing distance from his wife made it clear that his attention was anywhere but on her. Despite this, the public refused to believe she had no influence over him. Whenever Alfonso made unpopular political decisions, blame fell squarely on Victoria Eugenie. She became a scapegoat, accused of manipulating the king, despite the fact that he no longer sought her counsel, or even her presence. Rather than fight an unwinnable battle, Victoria Eugenie chose a different path. Instead of dwelling on her husband's infidelities or the constant criticism from the court, she redirected her energy toward making a real difference. She threw herself into charitable work, focusing on healthcare, education, and poverty relief. Determined to improve medical services in Spain, she became heavily involved in reorganizing the Spanish Red Cross, ensuring better medical aid for soldiers affected by the war. Her healthcare reforms saved countless lives, offering better survival rates for the wounded and financial assistance to families who had lost their male providers. Through her tireless efforts, she won the respect of the people, not as Alfonso's wife, nor as a foreign queen, but as a compassionate leader in her own right. To this day, many landmarks across Spain still bear the name of Victoria Eugenie, a testament to her impact on the country. Even Pope Pius XI recognized her contributions, honoring her with the prestigious Golden Rose, a rare papal award given to women of exceptional virtue and service. Despite enduring years of hardship in her marriage, Victoria Eugenie never wavered in her duties as queen, from the moment she arrived in Spain until the very end of her reign. But her struggles extended beyond her personal life. Like her royal cousins in Russia, Greece, and Romania, Victoria Eugenie found herself at the center of growing political turmoil. The bomb attack on her wedding day had been a dark foreshadowing, a warning that Spain's stability was already beginning to fracture. In 1909, violent unrest erupted in Barcelona, further confirming her fears. Though she was never personally harmed, she sensed the shifting tides of the country, a transformation that no royal decree or charitable act could stop. The 1920s brought even greater challenges. Victoria Eugenie's relationship with Alfonso had deteriorated completely, they were no longer husband and wife in any real sense. In private, they lived separate lives, and in public, they barely spoke. Yet, as their marriage crumbled, Spain itself was also unraveling. Discontent with the monarchy and the government had reached a boiling point. Despite Alfonso's desperate attempts at reform and Victoria Eugenie's unwavering commitment to charity, it was too late. The momentum of revolution had become unstoppable. On April 14, 1931, Spain's major cities fell under Republican control, with revolutionaries demanding the king's immediate abdication. The monarchy's fate had been sealed, the Second Spanish Republic was declared, bringing an end to Alfonso's reign. Realizing that resisting would only lead to bloodshed and civil war, Alfonso chose exile over conflict. He fled to France, leaving Victoria Eugenie and their children behind to gather their belongings and escape on their own. Outside the royal residence, a massive crowd had formed, growing increasingly aggressive. As the tension escalated, protesters began attacking the castle gates, making it clear that the royal family had little time left. With no other choice, Victoria Eugenie quickly packed her most essential belongings and fled Spain with her children, leaving behind the country she had called home for 25 years. The royal family reunited in Marseille, their once glorious dynasty now reduced to a family in exile, forced to leave behind a country that no longer wanted them. From there, they traveled to Paris, where they would begin their uncertain future away from Spain. The weight of this loss fell heaviest on Alfonso XIII. Once a proud ruler, he now found himself a king without a throne, a leader without a nation. Alfonso's deep frustration quickly turned to rage. Humiliated, resentful, and powerless, he lashed out at Victoria Eugenie. His legendary temper, which had always simmered beneath the surface, now boiled over completely. He accused her of being a curse on his family, blaming her for everything, from the collapse of the monarchy to the hemophilia that had plagued their sons. His cruelest accusation, however, was a personal one. In a final act of malice and desperation, Alfonso implied that Victoria Eugenie had been unfaithful during their marriage. After years of silent endurance, years of watching her husband flaunt his own affairs, this was the moment when Victoria Eugenie had enough. For decades, she had endured public humiliation, betrayal, and his cold indifference, but now, stripped of their titles and power, she realized she had nothing left to lose. She refused to tolerate his abuse any longer. Their already broken marriage ended for good, and they parted ways permanently. Alfonso settled in Rome, Italy, surrounded by what remained of his loyal royalist supporters. Meanwhile, Victoria Eugenie chose Switzerland as her refuge, seeking a place where she could finally live life on her own terms. For the first time in decades, she was free from the pressures of the Spanish court, free from Alfonso's resentment, and free to focus on what truly mattered, her family. She dedicated herself to her children and grandchildren, finding joy in watching them build lives of their own. She attended their weddings, welcomed newborn heirs, and took comfort in the role of a matriarch, surrounded by the next generation of Spanish royalty. But fate had not finished testing her. In 1934, her youngest son, Prince Gonzalo, was involved in a car accident. His injuries were not life-threatening, and for most people, it would have been a minor incident. But Gonzalo was a hemophiliac, one of the very things Alfonso had once blamed her for, and despite the best medical efforts, he slowly succumbed to internal bleeding. Victoria Eugenie had lost her son to a disease she had unknowingly passed down, a pain no mother should ever have to bear. And yet, 4 years later, in 1938, the nightmare repeated itself. Her eldest son, Alfonso, met the same tragic fate. Another minor car accident, another uncontrollable hemorrhage, and another irreversible loss. It was cruel beyond words. In exile, she had already lost her country, her title, and her husband, but now, she had also lost 2 of her sons in the most agonizing way possible. It seemed as though fate had taken everything from her, leaving her with little more than her memories and grief. By 1941, Alfonso XIII's own health had begun to fail. The once powerful king, who had so angrily cast Victoria Eugenie aside, now lay frail and dying, suffering from advanced heart disease. Victoria Eugenie, despite everything, chose dignity over resentment. She gathered their surviving children and traveled to Rome, ensuring that Alfonso would not face his final moments alone. As she stood beside his bed, she looked down at the man who had once ruled Spain with unchecked authority, the man who had blamed her for all his misfortunes, and the man who had long ago stopped loving her. But in that moment, none of it mattered anymore. The bitterness and anger that had defined their relationship had faded with time, replaced by something far more powerful: acceptance. There had been love once, long ago. But it had not been enough to survive the weight of royal duty, political turmoil, and personal tragedy. Victoria Eugenie watched in silence as Alfonso breathed his last. After the funeral, she returned to Switzerland, closing the final chapter on her tumultuous life with him. Time passed, and Spain changed. In 1968, at the age of 81, Victoria Eugenie returned to Spain one last time. It was a historic moment. After nearly 4 decades in exile, she was welcomed not as a fallen queen, but as the grandmother of Spain's future monarch. She had come to witness the baptism of her great-grandson, Prince Felipe, the boy who would one day become King Felipe VI of Spain. This was her final public appearance, a quiet acknowledgement that her family's legacy would live on, even if her own time had nearly come to an end. After returning to Lausanne, Switzerland, her health quickly declined. On April 15, 1969, at the age of 81, Queen Victoria Eugenie passed away peacefully in her Swiss home. But even in death, her journey was not yet over. 6 years later, her grandson, Juan Carlos I, restored the Spanish monarchy, taking the throne after the fall of Franco's dictatorship. Spain had finally become a constitutional monarchy, and Victoria Eugenie's exile was symbolically undone. In a final act of reconciliation, her remains were brought back to Spain, where she was reinterred in the royal pantheon El Escorial, alongside her husband, Alfonso XIII, and their sons. She had suffered betrayal, heartbreak, and exile, but in the end, she returned to the country she once ruled. Queen Victoria Eugenie's life was far from the fairy tale it first appeared to be. Despite enduring a troubled marriage, political upheaval, and personal losses, she remained dignified and devoted to her role as queen. Though her later years were spent in exile, her legacy lived on through her descendants, eventually returning to Spain when her great-grandson, King Felipe VI, took the throne. What do you think of Queen Victoria Eugenie's incredible story? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into royal history, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.